I thought retirement meant peace. After 30 years of chasing criminals, running investigations, and dealing with real danger, I wanted Willowbrook Estates to be the quiet part of my life. Sarah and I bought the place because it looked like something from a postcard. Trimmed lawns, neighbors waving casually over fences, the smell of grills on Saturday afternoons. Nothing in the brochure said anything about HOA tyrants or property managers with vendettas, just clean streets and the illusion of calm. I should have known illusions have cracks. The housewarming party was Sarah's idea. She wanted us to start our new chapter the right way, introduce ourselves properly instead of those awkward driveway nods people mistake for friendliness. We only invited about 20 people, most of them folks I trusted more than anyone in my life. Retired brothers from the force, a few longtime friends, some neighbors who seemed genuinely curious about us. The plan was simple: burgers on the grill, some cold beer, a guitar brought by one of the detectives, and Miller's legendary potato salad. These weren't loud, rebellious kids. They were men and women who had spent decades protecting communities just like this one. If anything, we could have been billed as the safest backyard gathering in the state. The weather was perfect. Laughter mixed with the smell of charcoal, old war stories drifted across the yard, and for the first time since I signed those mortgage papers, I thought maybe, just maybe, I'd landed in the right place. Then she walked in, clipboard in one hand, phone in the other, heels too sharp for a suburban lawn. She moved like she was inspecting her troops, scanning every face, car, and sound like she'd been hired by God himself to enforce order. She introduced herself in a flat, professional tone. Rebecca, manager with Premier Property Solutions, residential community director. Her voice had the kind of authority usually reserved for courtroom stenographers who spend too much time around judges. At first, I assumed she was lost. Maybe she was here to drop off flyers. But the way she planted herself on my lawn told me otherwise. She said she was here to note our violations. Her lips never quite curled into a smile, just flat lines of disapproval. According to her clipboard, our music was too loud, even though you could still hear birdsong over it. Vehicles parked along the curb were suddenly blocking emergency fire lanes, lanes that didn't even exist according to the city's maps. And my personal favorite, we had failed to obtain prior community approval for gatherings of more than 6 people. 6. I blinked at that, waiting for the punchline that never came. The guests exchanged glances, some already chuckling under their breath, others looking uneasy as she circled cars with her phone like a meter maid with executive powers. Then, as luck would have it, Miller walked out with a bag of ice. In an instant, the atmosphere shifted. His face went pale, not from the heat, but from recognition. He froze halfway across the yard. Rebecca had finally stopped writing on her clipboard, but only because her eyes had locked onto him like a predator spotting a wounded bird. Her mask slipped, and suddenly this wasn't about volume levels, cars, or permits. This was about history, dirty, bitter history. She was Miller's ex. Their divorce had been brutal enough to make precinct gossip for months. He'd transferred units just to avoid running into her around town. Now here she was standing in my yard, and it was like watching an unresolved knife fight reignite under the guise of HOA authority. Rebecca didn't just double down, she detonated. Suddenly she wasn't citing generic community standards. She was inventing codes that sounded like lines from a paranoid sci-fi script. Unauthorized assembly of law enforcement personnel. Conspiracy to circumvent oversight protocols. Failure to disclose police affiliations to management. One after another, she stacked imaginary charges like bricks, quoting fines with precision as if she'd rehearsed for this very run-in. According to her calculations, our little barbecue carried a price tag of $2,500 in violations. For grilling burgers, we laughed. Of course we laughed, but her face never cracked. She believed every absurd word to the point of pulling out her phone and saying she'd have to escalate this criminal matter. And before I could stop her, before Sarah could step in with the voice of reason, Rebecca was dialing 911. Her words to the dispatcher still replay in my head. Retired police chief hosting unauthorized law enforcement assemblies. Possible corruption in progress, need immediate response. 15 minutes later, red and blue lights strobed across our manicured street. 7 squad cars, sirens blaring, descended like we'd set up a cartel operation instead of a cookout. I braced for what I thought would be a messy, embarrassing standoff until the first officer climbed out and grinned. "Chief?" "No way, how are you?" he said, striding forward. That lieutenant had worked under my command for 8 years. Behind him was a sergeant I'd graduated academy with, and another detective I'd bailed out of political hell during an investigation a decade back. Handshakes flew like confetti. Backs were slapped. Introductions exchanged with my guests. It wasn't a standoff. It was a reunion. And all the while, Rebecca stood stiff in her perfect suit, realizing that her report of a criminal conspiracy had turned into an officer's barbecue meet and greet. They mocked her. Not cruelly, but enough to strip her authority clean. "Ma'am, do you always summon the cavalry for backyard burgers?" One laughed. Another asked if she'd been sampling the punch. Miller finally broke his silence, staring his ex-wife down. "Rebecca," he said flatly, "you just called half the city's police force to shut down a retirement BBQ. Even for you, that's low." Her face twitched between fury and humiliation, and after a moment of sputtering about legal consequences and oversight, she stormed off across my lawn. As she slid into her car, she glanced back at my house with eyes too calm, a smirk too forced. That's when years of instinct crawled up my spine. The look wasn't of someone defeated. It was of someone planning. The kind of look I'd seen in suspects who weren't finished with their games, just transitioning to their next move. And by the time her taillights disappeared, I knew this wouldn't end with a laugh over potato salad. 3 days after Rebecca's humiliation at my housewarming party, I found a thick envelope waiting in the mailbox. Not on HOA letterhead, not from City Hall, but from Premier Property Solutions, Rebecca's playground and corporate branding. Sarah saw the look on my face before I even opened it. She just rolled her eyes and said, "She's not finished." She was right. Inside were 3 separate violations stapled together like receipts from a mob shakedown. The first charged, found $200 for hosting an unauthorized community event. The second fined me, $800 for noise. Disturbances. The third claimed another, $500 for improper guest parking and community fire. Lanes. Fire lanes, I might add, that didn't exist on any city map. The total came to $2,500 due within 14 business days with threats of further penalties and eviction filings, if unpaid. No photos attached, no certified delivery confirmation, just her logo stamped across the paper like an attempt at legitimacy. I laughed at first. 30 years in law enforcement had trained my eyes to spot fakes, whether they were counterfeit bills, forged IDs, or fabricated warrants. These violation notices had all the hallmarks of intimidation: misused legal jargon, code sections that didn't exist, and formatting so sloppy it looked like a college kid trying to bluff through a paper. She even bolded fines in red ink like some deranged collection agent. But the thing was, they'd work. Not on me, maybe, but on plenty of my neighbors who didn't know any better. These papers looked official enough to scare good folks into pulling out a checkbook. So I started asking, and what I uncovered made my blood pressure spike harder than any foot chase ever had. Mrs. Henderson from 2 doors down leaned toward me like she was passing state secrets. She fined me $3,000 for unauthorized garden modifications. I asked what she meant. Her lips quivered. I planted hydrangeas. She said they weren't approved. Next week, her landscaping company offered to correct the violation for the exact same amount. Henderson had paid just to make it go away. A retired vet at the corner admitted he had forked over $2,400 for roof color variation. Rebecca herself had driven by, claimed his dark shingles, disrupted community aesthetic standards, and then connected him with a contractor who, surprise, shared an address with Premier Property Solutions. He paid for repainting he didn't need. Then came the young family with 2 kids who told me they had been slapped with a $800 fine for emergency drainage correction. They hadn't requested an inspection, but Rebecca's affiliate showed up anyway, declared the foundation unsafe, and charged them on the spot. The fear of losing their home made them comply. It was always the same story. Mysterious violations appeared out of thin air, threatening letters demanded money, and her other businesses miraculously offered solutions to avoid eviction. It didn't take a detective's brain to see the pattern. She wasn't just skimming money on HOA technicalities. She'd built a self-feeding machine. Premier Property Solutions declared the violation. Greenscape Landscaping offered inflated corrective services. Disputes got managed by a legal-sounding outfit calling itself Resolution Partners LLC. Different logos, same owner. When I pulled business registrations at City Hall, each one traced back to the same P.O. box Rebecca controlled. This wasn't property management. This was racketeering with corporate stationery, and the darkest part? It was brilliant logistics. She created the problem, sold the fix, and silenced appeals, all feeding into the same bank accounts. To a frightened retiree, it felt like due process. To someone who'd worked fraud cases alongside the FBI, it looked like a closed-loop criminal enterprise. Evidence kept piling. I found neighbors who'd refinanced homes to cover Rebecca's demands, others who'd drained pensions to keep peace. Most whispered their stories with shame, like they had failed by being conned, not realizing they'd been targeted systematically. That's when one woman, voice trembling, told me she'd also hired Rebecca's tax consultation service. Her property tax suddenly spiked. Rebecca offered to fix it for half the cost of the increase. Later, when she delivered the documents directly to the assessor, she learned Rebecca had forged filings to artificially inflate valuations. Manufactured crisis followed by a profitable solution. That night I sat in my study surrounded by copies of fake notices, contractor invoices, and business registrations, and for the first time in my career as a cop or as a retiree, I genuinely felt sick. Not because we couldn't stop her, but because this scheme was perfectly designed to prey on people least equipped to fight back. Retirees, widows, young families with no legal know-how. People like my neighbors who wanted to avoid confrontation, so they paid quietly. By the time they realized, they were already drowning. Rebecca wasn't satisfied writing me a bogus $2,500 bill. She had built an economy of fear, one that turned every flower, roof, or party into currency. Pawns on her chessboard, producing money every time she declared a failure of community standards. And looking at the stack of papers in front of me, I realized something chilling. She hadn't even hit full stride yet. My investigation threatened her cartel, so she would push harder, nastier. That suspicion was confirmed the next morning when I opened the mailbox again. No invoices this time, just a clear plastic bag with another dead fish inside, sliding across government junk mail with its glassy eyes staring. Underneath lay a note: retirement should be peaceful. Stop digging or it won't be. Same blocky handwriting as her violation notices. Same sloppy ink smudges. Sarah screamed when she saw it. My hands just went still, holding the plastic with numb fingers, because I knew what that meant. She had taken the mask off. This wasn't just fraud anymore. She wanted me to know it could become war. 3 mornings after I pulled that dead fish from the mailbox, the next escalation landed. Not in ink, not in whispers, but in an official-looking manila envelope handed to me by a courier. Sarah opened it before I could even hang up my coat, her voice sharp with disbelief. It was a restraining order. Against me, filed by Rebecca. The very woman running this fraud empire had managed to flip the script so hard that now, on paper at least, I was the problem. Reading through the lies made my stomach knot. She claimed I followed her in the neighborhood, harassed her, threatened her, even intimated neighbors into silence with my former police authority. Fabricated witness statements were attached, one signed by a Jennifer Walsh who, when I checked later, didn't exist anywhere in our community. It was masterful con artistry. Photos of me confronting her surveillance car at midnight were included, but they'd been shot at odd angles that made it look predatory. Audio recordings were embedded too, clearly doctored. Conversations stripped of context, cut to sound like I was warning neighbors instead of listening to their complaints. If I hadn't lived it myself, even I might have believed the picture she'd painted. The order bore the signature of a local magistrate, the kind of approval usually issued automatically when someone claims fear for their safety. But Chris, my old partner, dug into the judge's background and discovered what I already suspected. Golf trips with one of Rebecca's vendors, dinner photos on social media with her landscaping contractor, cozy ties that reeked of backroom fixes and conflicts of interest. The restraining order was effective immediately, which meant I couldn't technically approach Rebecca, her property, or even attend certain community meetings she might chair. It was a gag order disguised as victim protection, a shield she could now wave any time her fraud was challenged. More dangerous, it chilled the neighborhood. A handful of residents who had spoken to me earlier, brave enough to whisper about their own bogus citations, stopped returning calls. Some flat out avoided me on the sidewalk. Mrs. Ramsey, who had given me those details about her $3,000 landscaping fine, suddenly insisted she must have been mistaken. A young family who'd been hit with drainage scams packed up overnight and moved out without warning. It wasn't coincidence. Fear was spreading in a way I'd seen my entire career on organized crime cases. When witnesses get spooked fast and all at once, it's because they've been pressured. Threats whispered, cars following them home, maybe phone calls in the dark reminding them they had kids or mortgages too fragile to risk. It was textbook intimidation. But this wasn't just gangland thuggery. It was property management turned into racketeering. Rebecca had elevated it, using the illusion of corporate legitimacy to cloak fraud in policy enforcement. By then, Sarah was pleading with me nightly to drop it. "She's dangerous," she said, tears welling. "She doesn't care about rules. She'll burn this entire neighborhood before admitting defeat." I heard her, but I couldn't stop. Not just because of pride, but because I knew if we rolled over, every other resident would keep bleeding under her scheme. Silence would mean she wins. And I'd taught an entire generation of officers never to look away when victims can't fight for themselves. The breaking point came when an elderly man from the corner house shuffled up my path one evening. He leaned on his cane, eyes cloudy with cataracts but sharp with purpose. He closed our kitchen door behind him, looked Sarah in the eye, then lowered his voice. "I'm not just another retiree. I'm federal, undercover, been watching Rebecca for months." My jaw tightened. He explained everything. He said she wasn't really Rebecca, not originally. She was someone else. Martha Kellerman, a fraudster on FBI's radar for years, suspected of running identical operations in Arizona, Nevada, Colorado. Retired officers with fat pensions were her favorite prey. She knew exactly how to drain them. His role had been surveillance until now, but with my photos, evidence, and that dead fish, she'd crossed into a pattern feds recognized as Phase 2. That meant eliminating threats outright, like witnesses who wouldn't scare easily. Suddenly, the fish in my mailbox seemed quaint. The sedan photographing my house wasn't just intimidation, it was recon. The restraining order wasn't just harassment. It was legal cover she could cite if something happened to me. My instincts as a cop collided with the reality in my bones. She was preparing to make me the next example. Chris wasn't surprised when I called. He muttered that her escalation was too fast, too organized to be lone wolf vindictiveness. "She's part of a network," he said. "This is racketeering. Multiple shells, money diverted. Intimidation campaign, classic." He was already unraveling more links. Property taxes manipulated, letters intercepted, accounts rerouted. Rebecca, Martha, whatever name she wore, she wasn't just petty. This was an intricate con with federal depth. That night, sleep didn't come. Each creak of the house, every flicker on the camera feed kept me on edge. Sarah clutched my arm with white knuckles, whispering, "She's not going to stop." I believed her. Fear wasn't alien to me. I'd walked crime scenes draped in it. But this felt personal. Rebecca wasn't humiliated and done. She was humiliated and leaning into fury, the kind of anger that drives people to take reckless, destructive steps. By dawn, we woke to find chalk scrawls on the driveway. "Rats get exterminated." It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. The message was clear. Rebecca had declared war in the neighborhood, and I'd been cast as her enemy number one. It was no longer about fines or hedges or barbecue gatherings. This was escalation into something uglier. Fraud had bled into intimidation into open threats, and in my gut, I already knew what patterns like this end with. Arson, ambushes, silencers. Organized crime doesn't let loose ends dangle. 3 nights after the restraining order debacle, the truth finally became too big to ignore. The elderly man, the one who had appeared at my kitchen table looking like just another retiree, wasn't just some bored neighbor with time on his hands. He was a federal agent, embedded in Willowbrook Estates for almost a year. He spoke in quiet, measured tones, like someone who'd spent too many months in deep cover, always calculating how much to reveal. "Ethan," he said to me, "Rebecca isn't Rebecca. Her real name is Martha Kellerman." It was the kind of line that felt cinematic, but the evidence he laid out was stone cold. Photos of her surfaced from Arizona, Nevada, and Colorado cases where retirement communities collapsed under manufactured violations. Charts showing diverted pension funds, shell companies mimicking HOAs, elderly residents bankrupted by fees that had no legal foundation. The pattern wasn't coincidence, it was strategy. Rebecca, or Martha, had been perfecting the system for years, and the reason it hit me so hard was because I could instantly recognize the precision of it. It wasn't sloppy crime. It was organized, built like a cartel, except the product wasn't drugs or weapons. It was fear and compliance, and now I'd become the glitch in her formula. Chris confirmed the scale when he recovered an encrypted flash drive she'd carelessly tossed in her trash. Our tech guys pieced together stuttering fragments of email chains, but what survived turned my blood to ice. A target list, 43 names spanning 5 states. Many of them had little notes beside them. High pension, prone to compliance, or worse, non-compliant. Requires pressure. My name was there too, bolded, with chilling shorthand. Problem homeowner, activate Phase 2 Chicago methods. I didn't need it explained to know what Chicago methods meant. 20 years ago, I had helped investigate a case where a retired FBI agent named Michael Torres died in a house fire later linked to property management fraud. Investigators smelled accelerant. Neighbors heard noises, but the fire was ruled an accident. His widow had been silenced with payouts and non-disclosure agreements. The parallels were so clear I could practically hear Martha dictating the future. If intimidation doesn't work, make the problem disappear. And right on cue, 2:47 a.m. that night, my security system roared to life. Lights erupted in the backyard like a stadium. Sprinklers hissed on automatically, sensors detecting heat where there should have been nothing. When I flung downstairs, Sarah right at my heels, the cameras showed 2 masked figures dousing the perimeter of my house with accelerant from red plastic cans. Professional, efficient. Intent was obvious. They weren't teenagers looking for trouble. They were there to burn us alive in our sleep and let the charred ruins look like another suburban tragedy. What they didn't expect was that 30 years of paranoia had made my retirement home a fortress. Motion detectors triggered alarms, lights, sprinklers. Gates sealed automatically. Water coursed across the lawn, neutralizing their chemicals before they could ignite. More importantly, every move was recorded in crisp high definition. Their faces looked straight into the black glass of my hidden cameras as they realized the trap. They scrambled, almost tripping on each other in their rush to escape. But Chris was already across the street in his car with eyes on them, radioing coordinates to federal surveillance units. The feds had been planning a coordinated takedown in a week's time, targeting cells in multiple states. But after the attempt on my family, decisions came fast. At 3:10 a.m., the undercover agent whispered into his phone, "Pull the trigger." Across 5 states, lights turned on in FBI field offices, armored vehicles rolled out of garages, and arrest warrants that had been waiting in sealed envelopes finally saw the night air. Rebecca wasn't dumb. She knew she'd overplayed her hand. At dawn, she was in a black SUV with 2 of her enforcers speeding out of the neighborhood. The car was loaded with burner phones, fake IDs, and bags stuffed with cash peeled from residents she'd bled dry. I only knew because 20 minutes later I watched a live drone feed on Chris's laptop. Black SUV weaving dangerously through county roads as patrol cars closed in. Road spikes forced her straight into a fountain she had once fined a neighbor $200 for violating. The irony was enough to make even a hardened old cop chuckle. When they dragged her out, mascara streaking, cuffed and spitting fury, the neighborhood gathered like moths to flame. People stood in slippers and housecoats, phones aloft, recording the moment their tormentor finally lost her power. She ranted about how we should be grateful, how she had organized chaos into order, how none of us would survive without someone in charge. But her stagecraft crumbled against the sight of federal agents reading her rights. She wasn't an HOA queen anymore. She was an interstate felon. And even as relief surged through me, one glance at the agent reminded me this wasn't over. "You don't understand, Ethan," he whispered. "Rebecca is one gear in a bigger machine. Tonight we cut one engine, but there are dozens more. She's part lieutenant, not commander." His words stuck like splinters. Retired life was supposed to mean barbecues and grandkids. But standing against my porch railing at 4 a.m., smoke still staining the grass where men tried to torch my home, I realized what Sarah had said weeks ago was true. This woman wasn't going to stop. Not until someone stronger made her, and maybe that someone had to be me. The morning after Rebecca's SUV ended up sunk nose-deep in the community fountain, Willowbrook felt different. The fear that had hung over porches and sidewalks for months was replaced by a restless energy, like people had been holding their breath for too long and were finally allowed to exhale. By noon, everyone knew she wasn't Rebecca at all. Her real name was Martha Kellerman, and the agents who marched her away in handcuffs confirmed she wasn't just a property manager on a power trip. She was a wanted figure, part of an interstate fraud ring. Neighbors who had once whispered about notices and fines now spoke openly, swapping horror stories in the open daylight. They weren't afraid of her anymore, because she sat in county detention facing federal charges that no clipboard or certified letter could shield her from. The scope of it all unfolded slowly, trickling in through news updates, federal debriefings, and leaked evidence. The flash drive Chris had helped recover turned out to be the crown jewel, proving every step of her operation. Fake fines, shell companies, tax fraud, even wire transfers into offshore accounts. More damning were the coded emails about Phase 2, the assassination methods used in Chicago against Torres, and now attempted against me. Prosecutors grinned like wolves when they described how her arsonists had been caught on my cameras. "We won't just charge her with fraud," one said. "We'll bury her under RICO, racketeering, attempted murder, witness intimidation." For the first time since retirement, I sat across from law enforcement officers knowing I wasn't running the operation, but I was the central witness. It was surreal and sobering, realizing my backyard barbecue had detonated into a federal case stretching across 5 states. The legal process moved at a pace that shocked even me, considering how sluggish courts usually are. Within 6 months, Martha's trial became national news. Headlines called her the HOA Queen of Fraud and the Karen Crime Boss. Prosecutors rolled out charts, timelines, and testimonies like weaponry. They had it all: fraudulent invoices, doctored restraining orders, falsified witnesses, intimidation letters, dead fish in mailboxes, emails about neutralizing problems. Financial analysts traced $4.2 million in stolen money across multiple communities. Victims testified about losing life savings to imaginary violations. Seniors broke down describing how they had refinanced homes to pay for repairs that never happened. It became clear to the jury in just days. This wasn't mismanagement or clerical mistakes. It was organized predation. Martha sat through it all, alternating between rage and smugness, but the mask slipped for good when sentencing day came. The federal judge read out 47 charges: wire fraud, mail fraud, racketeering, conspiracy to commit murder, attempted arson, operating a continuing criminal enterprise. The sentence: 25 years in federal prison, no possibility of parole. She was ordered to pay back $630,000 in restitution for Willowbrook residents alone, alongside millions siphoned from other states. Her so-called partners, the shady contractors, the corrupt magistrate, even her brother-in-law attorney, were rounded up and handed sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years. The professional enforcers caught trying to torch my house received life without parole. The courtroom applause when the gavel dropped wasn't typical, but the judge didn't stop it. Justice sometimes is too human to confine to etiquette. But the real story wasn't what happened inside the courthouse. It was what happened in the neighborhood after. Premier Property Solutions was dissolved by federal order. In its place, we formed a resident-run HOA overseen by actual homeowners, with monthly open books, external audits, and no room for autocrats hiding behind clipboards. Property values, which had sunk during Martha's reign, shot up 30% once the fraud cloud lifted. Residents who had considered selling came back. Families who'd fled during the threats returned, their laughter floating back over fences. The retired vet who thought he'd lost his benefits, restitution and settlement let him get the wheelchair van he needed. That elderly woman who paid thousands for bogus landscaping, she got her money back with interest, enough to finally repair her old roof the proper way. Months later, she hosted a garden party in the very yard Martha once threatened to repossess. For me, peace came in smaller ways. The same cops who had shown up at my housewarming now showed up at community celebrations, not for emergencies, but to grill with us, to laugh, to remind us what law enforcement is supposed to be about. Chris launched his own investigative firm dedicated to stopping HOA fraud, and within a year he'd cracked 20 similar cases across the country. The undercover federal agent revealed that our fight had helped collapse an entire syndicate. Martha's story went into FBI training manuals as a case study: how organized fraud targets retirees, how intimidation escalates, what red flags to watch for. I found myself recruited quietly as a consultant, turning my retirement into a second career, the one I never expected but was proud to take. 1 year after Martha's arrest, Willowbrook Estates gathered at the rebuilt fountain. Instead of being a symbol of humiliation and fear, it now held a bronze plaque inscribed with the names of families who stood against her crimes. Kids tossed coins into the water and made wishes. Neighbors hugged and joked openly. Sarah leaned into me, whispering, "Looks like we finally got that peaceful retirement you wanted." She was right. It wasn't the calm I envisioned, but it was real, earned, hard-fought peace. And sometimes that's better. Looking back, I realize Rebecca, or Martha, or whatever name she used, never wanted community. She wanted obedience. She wanted order built on fear, and she thought we were too tired, too old, too complacent to resist. But what she forgot was that even retirees carry spines, and after 30 years of crime scenes, I wasn't about to let mine bend to a fraud with a clipboard. She turned my barbecue into a battleground, but in doing so, she exposed herself. In a way, she wrote her own ending the second she tried to weaponize 911 against burgers and potato salad. Now, every time I walk past that fountain or wave to neighbors mowing their lawns, I remind myself of something important. Criminals adapt, but so do communities. Fear breaks people, but it also unites them if someone has the courage to say enough. That's what we did in Willowbrook. That's why Martha Kellerman sits behind bars instead of behind a desk with a stack of fake violation letters. And that's why I'll keep consulting, keep watching, keep fighting. Because retirement isn't about running from battles. It's about choosing the right ones to fight.